Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome everyone to this morning or this afternoon session, depending on where you are. And since it's about the United States and Europe, I suspect we have a European audience as well. We also have a European panelist, I'm pleased to say. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I want to briefly introduce our guests and then we'll get right down to it. I'm helped today by the Scholl Chair Senior Adviser, non-resident Senior Advisor, Meredith Broadbent, also a former Scholl Chair. So I'm glad to have Meredith with us. She's going to help me ask the questions and moderate the effort. And we have really a stellar panel of people that follow these issues very closely and are going to have, I think, a lot to say about what happened in Pittsburgh on Wednesday. First, we have Cecilia Malmström, who is the former EU Trade Commissioner, also currently at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Next, we have Rob Atkinson, who is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who has written widely on all the subjects that were discussed in Pittsburgh and recently made some fairly provocative comments about what we should be trying to do with Europeans, which I hope you'll get into later on. And then third, we have Melissa Griffith, who is the Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program and is also at the Georgetown University Center for Security Studies. So we have a varied panel, and thank you in particular to Cecilia, who's coming to us from Sweden. It's mid-afternoon there, and a particular thanks to Melissa, who's coming to us from New Mexico. So it's very early in the morning, and I appreciate that. What we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion led by Meredith and me, and then we will throw it open to audience questions. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box or put it in the chat as you prefer, and we will we will get to it once we get through the questions that we prepared. Let me begin with the obvious first question, which is, what do you think? We've got a statement, we've got a lengthy statement, we've got announcements by the various chairs. What is your assessment of the first meeting? Is it a success? Is it a failure? Is it something in between? Some new word? Cecilia, let's start with you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Well, I think considering the circumstances and the fact that the meeting was almost cancelled at the very last moment, I think we should consider it maybe not a success, but at least quite good. They met, they discussed, there was a good ambiance. The expectations were not very high. They delivered a few more concrete statements on what to do on a short-term basis. And then they presented 10 working groups with quite concrete missions to deliver later. And considering how tense the relations have been across the Atlantic, I think it's really good that leaders meet this way. They discuss, they identify common challenges and a way forward. So I think the meeting went on as expected, I would say. Rather good.
Okay. Rob, what was your take on it? You're on mute.
I would endorse what Cecilia said. I think on a scale of 1 to 10, this was easily a 7.5, particularly given that expectations weren't super high to begin with. They laid out a number of specific things. Obviously, the proof is in the pudding. They've got to take action on it, but they laid out, I think, some important things: export controls, cooperation on investment review, cooperation on advancing 5G, 6G. Cooperation on semiconductors. There were very clear statements about pushing back on some non-market economy, who I'm not sure who that was a reference to, but it was some non-market economy out there. So, I think it was a good start. The real question, I think, is whether they can move forward with real concrete steps that implement these very good statements.
Melissa?
On the risk of sounding like a broken record, I also think it is a good start for many of the reasons already outlined. I don't think we wanted to be overly ambitious to the point of derailing the entire meeting in this kind of effort of cooperation. And I think it's really important when we're reflecting on whether this is a success or a failure to look at the moment and the environment in which this meeting took place. And I think that's sort of been hinted at over the kind of earlier statements. So this was in no way a guarantee that this was going to happen, both in terms of some tensions with the French over AUKUS that were heading into this meeting. You also had the German election that was occurring right on top of this, which sort of puts the Germans in a position now of needing to solidify their own domestic base and their policy agenda moving forward, which was happening on top of this. Some real disagreements between the US and the EU that were lingering in the background, terms like policy shield, DMA, the Digital Market Act, that were kind of lingering, and there were some questions about whether or not those would be discussed and some tension points. And then also, I think importantly, this kind of underlying reality that there's some real debates both between the US and Europe and within Europe around policy around technology in particular, and the ways in which technology intersect with China, the country that shall not be named, and the written statements coming out of this agreement, and some real tensions there as well that had to be kind of addressed or worked through. So I think it's given the moment, given the environment we're in, and the scope and the breadth of the issues, particularly on technology, which is what I work in, I think it was a very good first start. I would echo the concern that the question is not what is the first start, the question is what is the second, third, and fourth rounds, what these 10 working groups do going forward.
Well, I think you're right. China was sort of actually sort of the Voldemort of the meeting, the name that not to be mentioned, but it was infused throughout the thing. Let me ask it before I turn it over to Meredith. Although it doesn't mention China, wasn't this meeting really about China, or was it primarily about other things? Anybody?
Well, I think it's about both. It's clearly about the fact that the US and the EU have tensions, and as Melissa said, around DMA, around privacy shield, I think around some other areas where one could argue that Europeans are discriminating against US technology companies. So you can't have a successful effort on the TTC without bringing those issues up. But the big elephant in the room, and the area where there's real opportunity and motivation for deep cooperation, is the large non-market economy.
Well, as you said, China is not mentioned, but it's clearly all over the paper. Russia is also not mentioned, but it is in there as well. The Europeans were very eager that this was not going to be a China bashing meeting. Obviously, there are some joint concerns over China, and they are reflected in the paper, and there are areas where we can certainly cooperate on this. But there's more in this cooperation as well that does not involve China. So I think looking at it from that perspective, it's a rather balanced statement. But certainly there are some areas in investment screening, for instance, export control, in the use of artificial intelligence in a way that is not harmful for against human rights and so on. It's obviously directed vis-a-vis China, and areas where the EU and US could cooperate and find common ground.
I would agree with that. I think when we're looking at the context of this, you have some real concerns around China, both on the US and different European partners, some disagreement about what that concern should look like and what our response should be and how explicit we should be about that. But then at the same time, I think China gives us a very handy, I'm not going to say excuse, but I will say excuse, to get our own internal house in order, both in the US and Europe, and to tackle some of these long-standing technology policy questions, and sort of thinking through what that relationship will look like going forward and building that out. So I think in some ways, yes, China is this tension point, and China also offers us this moment, this impetus to have the conversation we needed to have, irregardless of what's happening with China.
Let me ask Cecilia kind of a follow-up question, if I may. You know, the meeting was preceded and almost derailed by the submarine deal that you alluded to, which raised the question really of US policy priorities, and the question of whether we're spending more time on China and less time on Europe, and whether that was the right way to proceed. Cecilia, what do you think? Does this meeting have any implications for the priority, where US priorities are? Do the Europeans feel left out or ignored as after this meeting, or do they feel the meeting has sort of rebalanced the relationship?
Well, I think this is not only about the French anger in the AUKUS. It goes back longer. During 4 years, there has been a lack of trust. Europeans have felt abandoned, have felt that the US is not the trusted friend and ally it used to be during the Trump administration. So there's a lot of trust building that needs to be done, regardless of it being now a new administration with a different rhetoric. And that takes time to build trust. And the best way to do it is, of course, to agree on concrete areas of cooperation where you identify the same challenges. So I think this is a very good step in that direction. I think that the French US-Australian disagreement will live on, but it will not spill over to this particular cooperation. That will go its own track, so to say, which is good. The discussion will continue, but in other forums, because this is fundamentally what it's about. It's about trying to get back on track on transatlantic cooperation. We have to be realistic on what can be done. There cannot be done a big trade agreement. I was negotiating the TTIP some time ago, if you remember that acronym. And there's also some disagreement on WTO, on steel tariffs, and so on. That was certainly raised in the margins, but also an agreement not to sort of let it dominate the meeting as such in Pittsburgh. And looking into all that, I think it was rather a success. And I hope that they can build on that and come back later showing the result of the different working groups.
Bill, could I just add to that? I agree that trust is one of the key elements here in rebuilding. I 100% agree with Cecilia that the way you do that is you get small wins. You find the areas where they're easy, then you sort of build out with a little bit of tension, and hopefully you try to get to the ones where there is real disagreement and see if you can have some compromise there. But I would argue the trust goes both ways. If this were a marriage counseling thing, would be both parties have violated the trust. And I think in Europe's case, the trust violation occurred in two ways. Now, you can disagree about this, but there is a general consensus among many in the US that the EU's digital sovereignty approach is really a protectionist, in some ways targeting US companies. We see that, I think, in the DMA. And whether that's real or not, it is certainly a real issue that has to be resolved from both sides. And the second is really China. I think the US feels as if Europe has taken advantage of our role with China. We see ourselves as pushing back against essentially a Leninist Maoist regime that is dictatorial and tries to impose their economic and worldviews and human rights on other countries. And I think the view is that Europe is not doing enough to help us. And again, whether those are real perceptions or not, I think they're real, but I think both sides have to come to figure out how we want to go forward working together in these two areas.
Absolutely, and I think you're right in identifying these two areas where there is disagreement, whether it's right or not. We can discuss, but on the digital issue, absolutely, you need to discuss. You need to look into the matter there. You need to see what can be done rather on a multilateral level or international than bilateral, which will cause more harm than solutions probably. On China, I think many in Europe agrees with your description. The problem is that the EU is 27 countries when it comes to foreign policy. And that is one of the few areas where there's still unanimously decided on the policy. So there are variations in different capitals on how you express yourself vis-a-vis China, depending on economic dependence and historical links and so on. So it's really hard to come to a hard common line on China, even if the feeling is more or less the same. And also the EU tradition is not really to have trade wars and to confront the way that the former administration did, but the current administration kind of continues. It's more working with other means. So hopefully with the balance that is reflected in the statement from the Pittsburgh statement, I think there is a lot of China, but it doesn't mention China. So maybe this is a compromise that both partners can live with for the moment. And then we see where we take it from there.
Melissa, do you want to weigh in before I turn it over to Meredith?
Sure. I think one of the things that we're sort of dancing around that's worth fleshing out is the difference between the public official outputs of this meeting and what I am sure was a significant amount of informal, kind of behind the scene conversations on some of these issues that are a little bit more thorny. So DMA is not in this draft legislation, this kind of meeting notes. You don't also have kind of mentions of privacy shield. China is not mentioned, but I would be amazed if those conversations were not had in more informal settings. And I think that also kind of is a word of caution when we sort of evaluate some of these big meetings. We tend to evaluate them on the public record, on these very official statements. And often some of the biggest bang for the buck is the opening of that dialogue and the opportunity to have those conversations much more broadly in a maybe quieter, less politicized manner.
Okay, Meredith, over to you.
Great. This is a gargantuan exercise, really, with 10 working groups and a lot of agency assigned for responsibility. Are there, as you all have assessed what these working groups are kind of tasked to do, where do you see outcomes for concrete progress in the future? What should we be hopeful about? Cecilia?
Sorry, I had a little problem with my microphone there. Well, I think there's this first, the short-term issues that were discussed on the deliveries on investment screening, on export control, on artificial intelligence, semiconductors. There, I really think that there will be something more concrete coming out in the spring. There was also an allusion to some working groups and some joint papers being published and so on. And then the rest, well, the timetable and the level of concreteness is a little bit fluffy, to say so, but obviously something on climate in light of the Glasgow summit. Maybe something can come up there on environmental standards and investment, on technology standards as well. Maybe something can come there. Cyber is difficult, but also there, I think conversations will continue. And the other things that we have alluded to that takes place sort of on a more informal basis needs to be thoroughly looked at, and then we'll see what can be presented. So it's hard to say, but I know that these working groups have already worked, and they are working all along and with different timetables, but there will be a new meeting in April or May maybe, and there's a time to check where are we and to present further progress and further instructions to the working groups.
Good. Melissa or Rob, did you have a comment on where you see or optimistic for concrete progress in the future?
So I think there's a lot of areas that we can have real progress on. I think one is there's a couple of export controls. We clearly need to work more closely on that, although to Cecilia's point, there's certainly a difference in Europe depending upon what industry and what country we're talking about. I don't know how that gets resolved, but clearly you can't have effective export controls by the US unilaterally. It's not good policy for anybody. That's one. I think investment screening is an easy no-brainer. We just need to formalize that process where the people on the US side who are looking at that are formally sharing information with the European counterparts and vice versa. I think that one just needs to be instituted. That I think we can get a lot of advantage on that. There's lots of Chinese investments that are very opaque. They pretend that they're not state-backed, but they are, and we need to really dig down deeper into when that happens and be able to deal with it. I think another area that I see as very promising is actual technology cooperation. We need to make sure that the EU and in my opinion, the EU and US semiconductor policies and technology programs are at minimum not at loggerheads, and hopefully aligned very closely so that our firms can cooperate with European firms and vice versa. I think that would be a big deal. I think the idea of 6G or 5G, really now it's sort of 6G is what we ought to be talking about. There's some real areas of tech cooperation I think would be valuable. The one thing I do worry about, though, there was language in the statement in one of the working groups I think it was on regulation, where it was talking about the power of online platforms. And yeah, I think it'd be nice to work together there, but my worry is that the Biden administration is going to adopt the EU approach, which I don't think is the right approach. So I think it's important and this is the point I made in the piece that ITIF wrote, that we need to make sure that we focus on US interests here where we can cooperate. And I think sort of adopting some of the more stringent regulatory approaches in Europe, for example, on AI, I don't think that the current Commission approach on AI regulation is one that would advance AI innovation. Maybe we can all cooperate on that. But at the same time, there was I was very pleased by this statement up near the top of the White House release, and it said something: the exchanges of the TTC are without prejudice to the regulatory autonomy of the EU and US, and, quote, should respect the different legal systems in both jurisdictions. And I think that's important because we're not going to change. Europe has its own approach. We have our own approach, and they're legitimate for both places. We shouldn't be saying, oh, we can't make cooperation if we have to change the other. We can work together without changing the other. And I think that's an important statement to put out right at the beginning.
Good. Melissa, did you have any ideas on concrete progress that might be possible?
Yeah, so at the risk of echoing what my fellow panelists have already said, so I'll be very brief. I think technical standards is one that I would like to see a lot of progress on, both because it's bounded, it's a tractable problem, and it's an important problem. So technical standards is an area I think that we could make some real progress. I think the technology cooperation is one of the areas we have the most opportunity to make progress on, and some of the most significant synergies and complements between both the US and Europe, and how we could make progress in those areas, whether that's AI, strategic technologies, 5G, and 6G, which are sort of critical, infrastructure questions, foundational technologies like semiconductors. I think there's a lot of room there. I would say that I also took some heart in some of the language out of this kind of meeting note draft, where you see a lot of conversation in reference to existing programs, largely in the US and also in the EU, on these topics, and a lot of effort has been made. So for example, out of the United States, a significant amount of work has been done around semiconductors already, laying some foundations and understanding those problems, AI, 5G, and similarly across the pond. So I think building on those foundations, I would have been more concerned if this seemed like we were sort of reinventing the wheel, starting from scratch. And I'm glad to see that we actually have some significant cooperation, building on domestic foundations already exploring those topics.
Great, thank you. Without a privacy shield, we're going to have trouble, I think, cooperating on digital regulation and AI and so forth. There wasn't much mention of solving that problem. What is your assessment of where we are on solving some privacy issues? Rob?
My understanding is that that's not going to be a formal part of the discussion, because it's something under consideration in the EU Court of Justice, and sort of separate negotiations about whether there are alternative mechanisms which would comply with EU law. Having said that, this has to be resolved. If we can't resolve this problem, it just puts a real monkey wrench into the whole idea that we would have better transatlantic relations. This is a big, big deal, and it has to get resolved. So whether it gets resolved one of the problems with putting it in the meetings is your next meeting's not for 6 months or something. We got to resolve this issue by the end of the year. We got to make some progress on it. So I think everybody knows that. I think the European officials are quite clear that that needs to be resolved. So hopefully it'll get resolved, but maybe not in this actual forum.
I agree that it needs
to. Oh, go ahead.
No, you first.
Oh, thank you. No, I would agree. I think that that sometimes when we look at these types of really significant, broad breadth scope meetings, there's 10 working groups, we tend to go through and say what's not there and then sort of ask why. And I think that it is important for these meetings to take place. Sometimes that means taking the contentious issues off the table so that those aren't going to derail a broader conversation in a public forum. But I also think it doesn't rule out having those conversations meaningfully in parallel. And I think that's what you're going to see around the privacy shield. So I would agree, it's something that has to be addressed. The way it's addressed is going to be incredibly significant to what the future of that kind of data transfer governance looks like between the United States and Europe. But it doesn't have to be addressed, I think, in this last meeting that we just saw in a public facing manner. So I think it's critical, but I don't think we have had a failure if we didn't address it right now and come to an agreement right now.
No, I agree with this. This is a very important issue. And as Rob said, it has to do with the European Court of Justice and not finding that there are not enough mechanisms for redress if there is a possible abuse from the European citizens. So this has to be resolved. Of course, everybody wants to resolve it. But it has long roots as well. I mean, this all stems from the Snowden affair, the surveillance years, and so on. So again, coming back to trust that need to be built. But the fact that it wasn't discussed doesn't surprise me at all, because there are constant meetings between officials and leaders in Europe and the US. And this will happen in parallel and has already happened in parallel to this. Is only one forum. It's a quite institutionalized forum, hopefully, we'll see. But there will be other discussions with the Attorney General and the people responsible for justice and these kind of issues in the European Union as well. So it is not very easy to solve. It will take time, but there is a commitment to try to find common ground here and to solve it, because it has implications on so much in our future cooperation as well. So I'm quite confident that in other types of working groups or informal contacts on different levels, it is being discussed.
Thank you. Bill, back to you.
Well, let's pursue one of the issues that several of you just alluded to, which is the DMA issue. Current Trade Commissioner Dombrovskis, Cecilia, your successor once removed, said the two sides, quote, could create a regulatory blueprint for the digital economy that is valid worldwide. With the EU pursuing the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, how feasible is it that the EU and the US can create a joint regulatory blueprint for the digital economy?
Well,
Rob, I think you're skeptical about that, aren't you?
Well, not only am I skeptical that it can happen, I'm skeptical that it should happen. The reality is countries just differ too much. And the idea of holding out for this sort of utopian world where we have one set of rules for the internet and the digital economy, I think is fanciful. To take a case in point, at least it was illegal in Europe, in Germany, to be able to access Mein Kampf, which is a perfectly legitimate rule for the Germans to have. In the US, it wasn't. We were never going to agree on that, nor should we have to agree on that. Same thing on privacy. We're never going to have, well, let me put it this way. I hope we will never have the GDPR in the US, because I think the GDPR is overly regulatory. I think we need a national privacy law, but to sort of force countries to have the same regulatory framework, I don't think you need that. Same thing on AI. I think it's a huge mistake to think that we need some sort of AI rule for the whole country, for the whole world. If Europe wants to have a certain set of rules around AI and transparency and trust and all this, it's perfectly legitimate for them to do that, as long as it's not discriminatory by country. It's just the meaning that a company who's selling AI services in Europe has to comply with that. That's fine. But it doesn't mean that the US has to have the same set of rules. So number one, I don't think that the whole idea is a good one. And secondly, what I worry about, particularly frankly, with the Biden administration, some of the folks who are leading this effort, like Tim Wu in the White House and Lena Khan in the FTC, who are much more oriented to a kind of European approach to antitrust and competition policy. I think that would be a mistake for the US to go down that road. So I worry when I hear we're going to have a cooperative framework, because to me, that means we're going to be adopting the European approach. Which I think would be a mistake. It's not to say we shouldn't do anything. I'm not a libertarian, but I think sort of importing the European regulatory system, including in competition policy, would not be in our interest.
I want to follow up, but Cecilia, you want to make a respond?
Well, this is obviously a domestic discussion in the US as well. I'm not want to comment on that, but there are areas where you could cooperate, and the conclusions from the meeting actually reflects some of it when it comes to disinformation campaigns, when it comes to illegal content on platforms, when it comes to and in other fora, there has been discussed also how to work together on terrorism online and so on. So there are areas where we can certainly cooperate. And I know there is a debate on antitrust and so on in the US. And if it's possible to achieve some joint rules, I think it would be good, but I do not underestimate the difficulties.
Melissa, you're nodding your head.
Yes, a lot of head nodding happening. I hate it when it happens when I agree with everybody before me. I'd love to throw some disagreement in just to spice things up. But no, I think that To me, I guess I would frame this slightly differently, which is a framework does not have to mean everything is identical or we import one model or another. A framework can be shared foundations, which I think is what Cecilia is pointing to, and they list quite a few, from human rights, disinformation, some concerns around content management, all of those things. I think there is significant shared interest. Those don't have to be identical, but it would be lovely if they were complementary and at least weren't in contradiction with each other, creating it quite difficult for sort of the global economy to function in ways that are very beneficial for both the United States and Europe. I think the other piece of this that was hinted at when Cecilia said there's a real fight in the US, and I think Robert pointed out this as well, the degree to which the United States is comfortable, the type of regulation that we are likely to pursue, our policy landscape around big tech or platforms is still a hot debate, I think, in the United States. And so there's also a moment here where our house is not quite in order. We haven't fully decided what our own domestic approach is. And I think you can see that actually across technology far more broadly. Many of these things, while there's a shared understanding there is a problem, the scope of that problem and the types of solutions we're willing to deploy is still a hot, interesting, lively debate within the domestic situations, both in the US, within countries in the EU, and then across the EU. So I think that if I was going to have to be a betting person and say this was going to be a really strong collective framework across a large number of issues, I would be unlikely to see that simply because of disagreement. And I think it's important to maintain those very different approaches on regulation that we see in the US and across the EU. And then also, I think that doesn't mean that there's no shared framework here, that there's no shared common understanding of some of the problems in some areas that if we can codify that we should.
Well, let me pursue that last thread for a minute with Rob in particular. Why isn't what you're advocating essentially going to lead to multiple internets and the fragmentation of the internet? Or does that not matter?
Well, there's a report that ITIF wrote, Daniel Castro and myself. It's called A Third Way on International E-Commerce, I think it was called. I think the key point there is you have to understand the difference between internet architecture and internet applications. And so internet architecture, it would be a mistake to have fragmentation. We need one root, we need one domain name system, et cetera, et cetera. And I really, frankly, am not worried about that. If the Russians want to go do their own thing at one level, who cares? If they want to isolate themselves, that's their problem. We're not, in my opinion, though, that's not going to happen. We will have one internet. But then that goes back to the issue of, we have one global auto system, auto industry, but we don't have the same rules around safety on cars. U.S. cars that are U.S. car makers that sell to Europe, they have to have a slightly different set of rules. And the idea that somehow you could get one set of rules for cars, I think is not logical or reasonable. And the same thing with the internet. Companies are particularly multinationals where you have nexus in another country. The expectation is you have an obligation to comply with those laws. So, for example, the French have the right to be forgotten, which I think is a terrible idea, but it doesn't break the internet. It just means that companies like Google do their thing in France. The problem is when France says to the US, you have to delete content in the US. No, that's the problem. So no way that other countries should be able to, and this is why I'm worried about what Europe is doing. There's no way other countries should be able to export their regulations to other countries that don't want them. But absolutely, companies have a responsibility to comply with internet regulations in the country they're doing business in. And the idea that we can come up with one set of rules for everybody, I think is fanciful. Last thing I'll say, a key component of making all this work is cross-border data flows. That's really, really important. But you don't have to have the exact same rules in every country.
But what we're talking about are rules that would interfere with cross-border data flows, aren't we?
No, I don't think so at all. Like, for example, just looking at commercial privacy, leaving out the NSA and other things like that. You take any company that's in Europe right now, Ford or Citibank or Procter & Gamble, and let's just assume they collect data. Well, they do collect data on EU persons, and let's say they want to bring it all into the US, all around the world to do data analytics on it. As long as they're complying with the GDPR in their handling of that data in the US, there is absolutely no problem. If they instead apply US rules to EU person data in the US, that's a problem. But that's why I don't think we need to have harmonization. As long as the companies can be held accountable by the EU government for what they do, it doesn't make any difference where they do it. If they violate the GDPR in Europe, they're just as liable as if they violate the GDPR in the US on EU person data.
Well, the alternative to harmonization is mutual recognition, which seems to be what you're implying. I'm not sure that we're getting there. We're not making much progress in that direction either with Europe.
Well, I actually don't even think that, Bill. There was a very important case a few years back in Canada where there was an American company in Canada, had a branch there, and it was taking Canadian person data, bringing it down to Canada, bringing it down to the US and doing something with it that was perfectly legal in the US, but illegal in Canada. That was brought to by the privacy commissioner in Canada, a case brought against the US company, and the US company was found guilty and was fined, as they should have been. Because the alternative is, if you don't think they can do that, then you can't have, then you're only left with two choices. No more cross-border data flow. So Canadian person data can never leave, or America has to have the same rules as Canada. And now here we're talking US, EU. That can't happen either. So to me, the only answer is you apply EU law to EU persons, regardless of where that is. And as long as the company has nexus.
So you could be forgotten in France, but the same person can't be forgotten in the United States.
Exactly.
Melissa or Cecilia, do you want to get into this before I go back to Meredith?
Well, if the companies applied the laws in EU, in the US, I mean, that would already be an important step forward. We're not there yet. And I agree that we need to find ways so that we can transfer data in a way that is trustful. And that's why we need to solve the privacy shield. But internet is, I mean, when it comes to illegal content, when it comes to child pornography, when it comes to terrorism and so on, it would be very useful if the platforms and the company, I mean, they're already starting to adopt their own rules of conduct and so on. But if it would be the same, of course, because there we are equally affected.
Melissa?
I would just add, because I think that obviously the conversation, I'm going to sound like a broken record. The conversation before me was quite comprehensive. The one kind of thing I would like to inject is I think there's an interesting moment here when we talk about regulation, legislative approach, and a little bit of tension in Europe in particular, where there is simultaneously an interest in building out domestic European competency, dare I say champions, an ecosystem, whether you want to call that kind of digital sovereignty or you want to talk about that in the context of the conversations around US platforms in particular, and a real amount of concern there, concerns around privacy. And those are often very US facing in a lot of their discussion, debate, and application. It'll be interesting to see how those evolve. And then at the same time, on the other hand, a recognition that the United States plays an important role in the European economic ecosystem, and that a lot of those alternatives currently are not necessarily European, they are in fact Chinese, and many of the goals and issues that the European Union is raising would be less well served under sort of Chinese institutional kind of capacity or their tech giants. So I think there's a real interesting disconnect here between some of the conversations around US tech supremacy, how we regulate big digital platforms, conversations around privacy and a privacy shield. And then on the other hand, the recognition that those platform companies are being displaced or competing, jostling with other big platforms that are up and coming in very different structures out of an economy, a certain market economy, state-led in very different ways, that has a very different vision on many of these issues, very different relationships with the state, and that those things are often in not quite kind of addressed as intention, but those two goals are not, they're not as, I think, in constant harmony as we might hope they would be. We're pursuing a lot of these regulatory approaches in the EU is not taking into account this other concern around China and whether or not those goals around privacy, those goals around digital innovation, having a strong European economy which relies on platforms and some of the benefits of platforms, those conversations just haven't been teased out, I think, to a degree I would like to see. So kind of moving off that lower level regulatory debate and how much we should be in harmonization and how much we should be mutually recognizing, up to a higher level of sort of saying this regulatory debate is almost in Europe has a double focus, and those two things haven't been rectified in a meaningful way, and that's going to have to happen to some extent.
Okay, audience questions are starting to mount up, so I'm going to send it back to Meredith for another question from her, and then we'll turn to the audience. Meredith?
Thank you. Of the 10 working groups, climate arguably received the least attention. What do you all make of that? Cecilia?
That is also being discussed in other fora. I think now there was sort of unspoken truce, an agreement not to bring up the CBAM, the proposal from the European Union to tax carbon, if you want, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This has been received with not great ovations in the US. But at the same time, there is a discussion on how to tax carbon also in the US. So I think this was an agreement not to bring up those differences and let it sink in a little bit. And there are other forums where you can discuss between the responsible people for environment and climate, where you could discuss, is there a possibility to find common ground here? This is only a proposal from the European Commission. It will take at least 2 years before it becomes legislation, if at all, or probably amended in different ways. So I'm not really surprised that it wasn't discussed there. It will be discussed in different ways, and it is, and it was an agreement not to touch that because it's too sensitive for the moment.
Rob or Melissa, any comment?
No, I 100% agree with that. ITIF issued a report on carbon border adjustment mechanisms just this week or last week, I guess. And I think what we're very skeptical. We believe in carbon. Let me put it this way. I think carbon border adjustment at the border level is very, very important. We need to do it. I don't think the CBAM is really the mechanism. It's just too convoluted, and even many in Europe admit that. So I think we have to find another way where we can cooperate on that. One idea is a carbon club, which is what we propose. But sure, we should be putting tariffs to prevent leakage and all. But I agree with Cecilia. There are a lot of other forums, including on tech cooperation. There's the whole commitment on climate innovation that Europe and the US have working on. So there's lots of other areas where we're working together on that. I actually don't think climate is the top area for the TTEC to be focused on.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I'll turn it to you for audience questions.
All right, let's turn to some of the audience questions. The first one is for Cecilia. It says the preamble of the meeting was not really about China, but about overwhelming influence of American internet industry on European sense of identity. Can Ms. Malmström clarify the term digital sovereignty, quote unquote, and explain how there can be unity when US and European starting positions are so different?
Well, I wish I could explain that. I think it means different things for different people, but we touched upon it formally. I mean, obviously the big tech platforms are all American, and then there are a few Chinese, and the European Union has for many, many years lagged behind. So there is a wish to see if European startups and new companies, if we could have more of those in the European Union, but that is not something that you sort of command and create in a weekend. You have to create the conditions, and then those companies eventually possibly will grow. But there is a political desire that we would have more autonomy, more independence in this, because of course we are very dependent on the American platforms, and the consequences of that and the possible disagreements, or we just had that discussion.
Okay, let me do another one. There was discussion about working on respective supply chains on semiconductors. Maybe we haven't said much about that so far. Can you comment about what they decided on semiconductors, and in particular, is strengthening semiconductor ecosystems in Europe or between Europe and the United States? Is that going to end up in conflict? Is it going to be the new Boeing Airbus case? Or is there a happy ending here?
Yeah, there's no way it's going to be the Boeing Airbus case. I just don't see that happening. Partly because why don't we have a strong Boeing Airbus case now? Because we've got COMAC. So COMAC, the Chinese are the great, they're the ones that bring us together. And in this case, the fact that they're putting over $100 billion of illegal and inappropriate subsidies, production subsidies into their semiconductor industries and firms, that's going to bring us together. It's not going to force us apart. So I think there's a lot of areas of cooperation. I'll give you an example. One of the things that we have in the US, we have a program called it used to be called the Focus Center program. I can't remember the new name of it, but it's basically DARPA and about 4 or 5 leading research universities doing leading edge, cutting edge work on semiconductor technology that's sort of 10 years out. There's no reason why we couldn't have that be a US-EU effort where we bring in leading EU universities. We all work together. Again, there's no reason why we can't have when we push for supply chain integration or our big funding programs that both our firms can't participate in those. That's what I would hope. I don't know. I think the odds of having cooperation are stronger than the odds of conflict here.
I would agree with that. I think there's some unique features around semiconductors that are worth kind of pulling apart on why we're likely to see more. I think there's an agreement coming out when you look at that working group to focus on the short term. So there's some prioritization that is happening there, which is, I still think you have 10 working groups. There's a lot more that will come to light around how we are prioritizing. We can't do everything equally, leveraging the same amount of political capital and resources across all of them. But you are seeing some prioritization under these groups, that short term versus the mid, long-term availability problems. I also think when you look at the kind of strengths of the US and Europe in semiconductors, there's a lot of good synergy there. And the ability to build off of each other. So when we think about 5G, the conversation around 5G is largely around the hardware space and some of the software space, and very strong European contenders, and then some couple Asian European contenders, and China as a very strong incumbent player, and the United States really jostling to try to build out an ecosystem that is trusted, given that landscape, with China as a very strong incumbent player. When you look at the semiconductor industry, the incumbent players are largely not China. China, in fact, is in a position now where they're investing significant amount of monies to become a more dominant player in that ecosystem. And a lot of the positions of strength are still inhabited by and occupied by US companies, European companies, and other Asian companies. I think this also, though, does point to something that we haven't addressed that is worth raising at this point, which is this is a US-EU conversation, and semiconductors are not just an US-EU conversation. And you see that in the kind of other bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral conversations that the US is having with other partners, particularly thinking about the UK, Japan, Australia, moving into the Asia Pacific region on these same issues. So I think that there's also this piece that's sort of lurking there, which is that, yes, this is a good foundation. We're likely to have a lot of agreement because we have some real complementary abilities there. There's an incentive to maintain some of those strengths we already have, but that kind of conversation and that strength in our ability to address the problems listed in the TTC meeting notes are not going to be US-EU alone. They're going to have to be far more global and cooperative, and you see that in the US approach.
Okay, to underline Mr. Atkinson's comment, how can Europe claim to legislate for the world when a large part of its digital world is controlled from the US and increasingly China? Sounds like putting a finger in the dike. Anybody want to take that one, Cecilia?
He doesn't claim to want to legislate to the world. It's trying to put, I mean, this is a very broad area. It goes everything from taxing to illegal content. But it is trying to see if we can find, as we discussed before as well, common ground and common framework, and where it's possible, a common agreement on how to regulate some of these issues. Because this is, it's true that most of the platforms are American, but also that gives the American platform so much power and influence over a lot of good things, but also some of the bad things that we need to look at how we can make the companies take a bigger responsibility. I was referring formally to disinformation when it comes to and we've seen how that has played out in some of the elections recently, when it comes to child abuse, when it comes to terrorism, and so on. And here I think we can find common ground.
So if I can just add to that, I certainly there are easy ones. I mean, not easy technically and all, but easy in terms of, yes, we all agree. We all agree about things like child pornography and human trafficking, all of those things we all agree on, of course. I think some of the other ones, though, and around content, it's not going to be as easy to agree. I mean, there's a legitimate debate in the US about what kind of content social media platforms should allow and what kind they shouldn't. And we certainly can't agree on that. There are people who say that Trump should have been deplatformed, people who say he shouldn't have been deplatformed. And at one level, I kind of agree with Mark Zuckerberg, where he's saying you're asking us to do that without any kind of guidance. So, I think one area maybe, could Europe and the US provide some ground rules? I don't mean in a micro legalistic sense where the government is deciding on each post, crazy idea, but some generalized guide rules. I know that Chancellor Merkel was upset that I believe, I could be wrong on that. I thought she expressed concerns about deplatforming Trump when he was in office. I think those are important issues that governments have to lay out the rules for. Same thing with Taliban. Taliban is running Afghanistan now. Should they be deplatformed? Should they not be? I don't think those are the decisions, frankly, that platforms should be making. I think those kind of decisions are governments should make. And there, I think we could cooperate and come up with some guidelines and frameworks.
Yes, and we need to be very careful that this doesn't develop to a sort of censorship exercise, because if we want to be credible and condemning China and others from censoring on platforms, internet and Weibo, and so we cannot do the same thing in our own backyard.
Exactly.
So, Rob, if information that is not available in France is available in the US, what does the right to be forgotten mean?
Well, look, I could pass a law that says the French can no longer criticize the US. And any post in the US that has to be taken down. And I would expect that the French to obey that law, right? I mean, that's my point, is that's the absurdity of it. Why do the French get to tell us what we can see and what we can't see? I don't think that makes sense. Imagine if I were to go to France and I read the newspaper. I mean, there was a great case. I think it was in Finland where there was a guy, I shouldn't laugh. There was, I believe it was Finland, might've been Sweden, might've been Norway, some Scandinavian country where there was a man who was I believe a child murderer, convicted, got out of jail. And then once he was out of jail, he wanted to be forgotten. I'm like, you never get to be forgotten. Never, ever will you allow, I think, should somebody like that be allowed to be forgotten. Now in Europe, you get to be forgotten. I was a child murderer, but I'm going to be forgotten. In the US, we're never going to allow that. And so, Bill, I just don't see any way. So if I go to that country and I pick up a newspaper with that guy's name and I come to the US and I start telling all my friends about, hey, John Smith in Norway is a child murderer, are you going to have me go to jail? So I don't see any difference between that and putting it online in the US. I'm happy to say the Norwegians or whatever that country is, if they want to not have anybody in Norway see that, that's their right. But they don't have the right to tell me or to tell you or to tell any of us what we can do with that information.
We've gotten kind of far away from the TTC, but Cecilia, do you want to say anything about that? Do you want to defend the regulation?
Well, I don't know about this case that you are referring to, but I mean, there is a problem in Europe, and I guess in the US as well, that some people, have their lives sometimes manipulated and circulates on all these platforms. Sometimes it's used as a revenge, publish pictures of people in disadvantaged positions and so on. You can never get rid of it. I mean, there has been several very severe cases of young people who have committed suicide because they can't get rid of these pictures, who are not, who are put there for evil reasons. So that is the reason why the whole debate started, and not because of child murderers.
Well, if I can sort of quickly, I 100% agree with you, Cecilia. I mean, that's why ITIF has strongly supported what's called a revenge porn law that makes that, illegal with strong sanctions against it, somebody doing that, completely inappropriate, completely unfair, and the platforms do work on that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the right to be forgotten in France is you committed a crime, there was a court hearing, you were convicted, it was in the newspaper, and then when you get out, you get to have that information removed from the internet. So that to me is very different than somebody bullying or putting inappropriate. I think they're two different things. And I 100% agree on the former with what you were saying.
Let me see if there's another area of agreement. We have a question here. Given the problems of lack of regulatory compatibility, which is sort of what we've been talking about, what do you think about data localization requirements? Is this something that should be part of the TTC agenda? Anybody?
It's not in any of the working groups. So I don't think this is an immediate area of discussion, but generally data localization is discussed in trade agreements. So I haven't seen it mentioned at all. So I don't think it will be subject of discussion.
So I think it should be. Again, I think there's two real issues with data local. There's the EU Court of Justice issue around government access, which is a specific issue, needs to be resolved. But let's assume for a moment, putting that aside, that we resolve that. Then there's the question of should Europe or any country be allowed to localize data? And that's a big, first of all, I don't think they should. Data is trade. As long as you obey the country's law where you're getting the data from, then it's, so I think that I hope that at least the council could come forward with some generalized statements supporting that, because the real threats in many ways are some other countries like Indonesia, China, where they really are using that for trade protection purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's one from my.
But I don't think there's much disagreement there. So maybe, you don't need long discussions, but because Europe also is not in favor of data localization.
Yeah. But a nice statement of support.
Mm.
Here's one from my CSIS colleague, Matt Goodman. The Biden administration talks about working with allies to, quote, protect and promote critical technologies. It seems easier to reach agreement with the EU on protecting, as reflected in the prominence of export controls and investment screening in the joint statement. Isn't joint promotion harder, given that we're market competitors? Where should the US and the EU focus their joint promotion efforts?
Well, yeah, it's harder, partly because we've never done it before, but we have in the US, we've done this for a long time, but particularly since the 80s, where we have had programs for pre-competitive research cooperation, where you have companies that are in the same market competing against each other, but they're able to cooperate in certain spaces. I think that's the principle we should be thinking about here. As long as neither country is free riding off of each other, I think cooperating in areas where we have capabilities will make us both stronger. So I think it's possible. I think it requires a little bit of vision and courage by policymakers, but I think it's very important to do. I don't think either of us now are big enough to have a dominance where we can do it all on our own. I think cooperation is a useful and important thing.
I'd build off that. I think one of the important features, yes, some of these companies are in cooperation. Sometimes we occupy very different parts of an ecosystem, so it's quite complementary. But I think there's also been a lot of concern, and I think this is why you see a lot of these technical consultations, agreements to speak and talk regularly before new policy or regulation comes out, sort of this consultation area, is because you don't want the national security or strategic interests of one country, the policy they put out, to undercut some other players, namely in this case, European players, that are an important part of that ecosystem as well, important for our security as well, and that we could actually be stronger if we had some interdependence there, some strategic interdependence, and didn't have to try to build this all out from scratch. So I think there's also just a recognition when we talk about promoting, and you see that peppered throughout. Yes, there's a lot of conversation about trusted, trustworthy, secure, making sure that component is there, but also making sure that we don't, in our effort to address some real concerns that we're seeing globally, undercut some of those strong technical and industry foundations in other countries, some of which are in Europe, that comprise those ecosystems as well, that make them as successful as they are, and that sort of their sustained growth and innovation will be important for the health of those industries going forward as well.
Okay, the last one, because we're running out of time here, is I'm going to start with Cecilia, and the other two can comment if you wish. It's more of a political question, but I think it's an interesting one. How does Germany's election this week and possibly protracted coalition negotiations impact US-EU work on these issues? Does a distracted Germany make these efforts more difficult?
No, whatever government we will have in Germany with the current playground, I think it will not change a lot. Fundamentally, all these parties are pro-European, pro-Atlanticists, with some nuances, but there would be nothing in this statement or in the program that any new government would oppose.
Okay, let me give all three of you an opportunity to make a final comment if you wish, and we'll go in reverse order. Melissa, do you want to close out with anything particularly profound or wise?
Particularly profound or wise. I will offer some closing statements and I will leave it to the audience to determine if they're particularly profound or wise. So I think from my vantage, as we're looking at TTC and trying to evaluate it and where to go forward, I think it's important, sort of going back to my opening statements, to understand the environment in which it came out of, and also the environment that that second meeting is going to be taking place in under an EU presidency that will be held by the French, and right in the shadow of a French election in spring of 2020 looks apparently when that will be scheduled. So I think there's an importance to understand that broader picture where it's situated, and to really be pragmatic in what's on the table and what we can achieve, and what shouldn't be on the table, what should be occurring in other venues. So I think that component's really important. I think it's important to recognize what we have accomplished here, which we haven't talked as much about. We focus a little bit more on what's not on the table in some areas of tension. This kind of meeting note is 10 different groups. They're quite broad, and they really echo the conversations in both the US and the EU around technology, everything from AI, semiconductors, 5G, technical standards, exports, regulations, concerns around market intervention by certain countries, companies, right? It's incredibly broad, climate. And so I think that ambition is worth applauding, and that this was something that we were able to meet on in the current climate and come to some agreement on is worth applauding going forward. I think the real question for me that I would like to see is how we tackle some of these companion issues that we've talked about, privacy concerns, data governance, and data flows. Some real concerns about the tensions between, I think, Europeans' vision for its own companies in relation to the US, and then US and Europe's visions for their collective security and their collective ecosystems in relation to some peer competitors, China, but not just China, that are coming up on the market. And then lastly, I think there will be an interesting moment, and I'm looking forward to seeing this, both in terms of how we actually prioritize across all of these 10. So where we really sink our political capital, keeping in mind that these are big lines of effort domestically in the United States as well. There's real resource, time, and political capital commitments there. So where we sort of prioritize. And then I'm also just looking forward to seeing, as the kind of time moves on, we're a little bit away from the more official public statements, what some of that private, less official, more unofficial conversation looked like as more of that comes to light, which I don't think we have good view into at this point. So I think keeping in mind the environment, what we've actually accomplished in light of what maybe we still need to do, but that overall that this is a worthy endeavor. And I think we should be glad that this conversation is happening on such a wide range of issues.
Okay, Rob, quick wrap up from you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all the great panelists and you and Meredith. During the Obama administration, I had the honor of co-chairing the U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group for the White House, and we met over a period of 5 years with our Chinese counterparts. And I'll always remember prior to an SNED meeting in Beijing, we were having a lunch with senior Chinese officials, and I was sitting at lunch with a Chinese official, and I asked him, don't you worry about the US kind of pushing you on these unfair practices you're engaged in technology? I said, no, not really. We can hold our own against you. And he said, we don't worry about the G20 because it's 19 other countries and they all spat with each other. He said, what we're worried about is the G3 or the G2. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, what we're worried about most is the US and Europe developing closer ties to constrain us and to limit what we're doing. And I thought that was a beautiful insight. And again, I'm not saying that the TTC has to evolve into a China bashing thing. It shouldn't do that. But I think we need to keep in mind, this is a big challenge to both Europe and the US. The Chinese, what they're doing, it's a challenge to the WTO, to the global trading system, to human rights. And we need to keep that in the back of our mind as we work together. And we can have our differences, but let's remember what the real challenger is here. And let's be able to continue to work together to, push back where we can, where it's appropriate for both sides.
Okay, Cecilia, you have the last word.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for inviting me. It was a pleasure. And I think we can come back to this in 6 months or so and see where we are. I think the Trade and Tech Council was a success in the way that there were concrete discussions. There is an outline of areas where to cooperate. There was a realization in written, because of course it's been there all the time, that we are friends, we are allies, we have a lot in common. We perceive same challenges, same threats, same possibilities. Now, of course, it has to boil down to some concrete issues. And there are lots of areas also outside the Tech Council privacy shield was mentioned, but we also have now in the upcoming Glasgow, can we find a common ground when it comes to the environment? Can we solve the steel tariffs? There's huge expectations in the EU that they will be abolished. Can we cooperate also in the reform of the WTO? There's a ministerial coming up in a month or two. And there we would really like to see more European, more American engagement in that. But it's a good start. I hope they will take it from there, but it's only one of several areas of cooperation. And at most, it boils down to the issue of rebuilding a lot of trust. And that is, a part is done, but not fully. So that is a work in progress.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks to all of you for a good panel. Certainly progress on Wednesday, but obviously challenges to go. This was very enlightening. That inspires me to suggest maybe we should do it again after the second meeting. And one person I talked to about this before the first meeting was the real question is who shows up at the third meeting? Because if the ministers stop coming, then you know the sand's leaking out of the bag, and this is going to end up the same way that all of the previous transatlantic efforts have ended up. But it starts with high hopes and a lot of promise, and we'll continue to monitor it. And so thanks to the panelists for their wisdom, and thanks to all of you for attending, and hope to see you the next time. Hope to see you Monday with Ambassador Tai when she will be speaking here at 10 a.m. If you haven't seen that, join us then. Thank you very much, everybody.